A femoral artery could dump 2.5 liters of blood before a brain went dark. And in a hole like Triage 4, that meant 90 seconds if the heart was still strong enough to pump hard. Sloane Mercer heard the leak before she found the leg. Not a scream, not words. A wet, hard hiss cutting through settling brick dust and the thin electronic stutter of a dying monitor. She kept chewing. The nicotine gum had gone flat an hour ago, bitter mint and battery acid on her tongue, but the snap between her molars kept time better than prayer. One mortar strike had folded the underground aid station inward like a kicked crate. Rebar groaned somewhere in the black. Burnt plaster drifted into her mouth. Blood and baked dust made mud on the floor. Sliding through it, her left hand found slick fabric, then flesh, then the hot pumping gap high in a Marine's groin where the artery had opened. He bucked once. Her forearm went across his pelvis and pinned him down. No overhead lights. No clean beam. Only a weak green pulse from a backup monitor and the tiny red wink of something shorting out near the far bed. Counting backward in silence because numbers were cleaner than fear. She reached for the pouch by touch and fished through cold steel. Tape. Gauze. Plastic. Hemostat. The jaws clicked once in the dark. Good enough. The wound kept pulsing across her knuckles, each surge thinner than the one before, because losing pressure meant losing life. And losing life happened fast when the line feeding the leg was also feeding the floor. 2 fingers drove into the meat to part tissue. The vessel jumped like a trapped wire. Clamp. A neat metallic tick. The spray stopped. Not all of it. Enough. The Marine made a low sound in his throat. More animal than human. Shifting her weight, Mercer reached for the tourniquet. Her left hand betrayed her the way it always did when things turned slippery. Missing those 2 joints changed leverage, made every pull a compromise. Hooking the strap with the scarred nub and the middle finger beside it, she braced the windlass against her thigh and hauled until the band buried itself into the leg, and the pulse below it vanished under her fingertips. Then stillness. Listening. No arterial jet. No death rattle yet. Just the monitor stumbling on weak current and dust ticking down around them like fine rain. One breath dragged into her chest. The air tasted like old concrete and fresh copper. Her sleeve smelled of antiseptic, drowned in rust. By touch, she checked the Marine again. Skin cooling. Carotid fast, but present. He would live if the world stopped taking pieces out of him for the next 10 minutes, which was the kind of joke war liked to tell. Wiping her palm on her trousers, Mercer reached for the smashed handset clipped to her vest. The casing crunched under her thumb. Dead. Antenna snapped. Battery half punched through. She spat grit off her lip and looked again toward that tiny red wink. A severed communications cable hung beside a toppled bed frame. Insulation peeled open where the blast had torn it free. Bare copper flashed in the dark. Ch. And small, angry sparks jumping between frayed strands, fading, then coming back. She watched it a half-second longer than she had time for. Data mattered. A broken thing that still bit might matter later. Above her, the ceiling gave a low metallic thump as debris shifted. Not collapse. Weight transfer. Boots. Maybe. Or charges being set. Grabbing a field dressing, she packed around the clamped vessel and cinched the wrap down hard over the groin while the gum snapped once, sharp and ugly, in the near black. The backup screen on the wall flickered green, dimmed, then steadied long enough to spit out the kind of message nobody in uniform ever forgot. KIA. The station had gone dead to the network the second main power failed, and the relay never came back. Somewhere above the earth, somebody had already written her and the rest of Triage 4 into a report with a timestamp beside it. Beneath the notice sat the battery icon, thin as a fingernail clipping, blinking at 12%. 12. Not enough for lights. Not enough for comfort. Barely enough for monitors and whatever else the blast had spared. Mercer looked at the Marine, at the hemostat, buried under bandage and pressure, at the copper cable, still spitting tiny sparks beside the bed, filed all of it away. Then the next problem announced itself, starting as a faint scrape, almost polite. Metal touching metal somewhere overhead. The sound deepened into a high, hungry whine that set her molars on edge and shook dust off the ceiling braces. Magnetic drill. Big one. It found steel up there and bit in. She tipped her head toward it, jaw working slow, and the whole dark room seemed to tighten around that rising shriek as the enemy began cutting their way down. The cold hit like a tool, not weather. -18 on the ridge meant exposed skin went numb first and then started to burn, and Marcus Thorne's face felt carved open by wind before he even looked down at the black icon pulsing on his wrist screen. Triage 4 had gone dark. K-I-A. No amber warning. No Stutner. No, maybe. Just a dead square where Mercer's station had been 2 minutes earlier. Snow hissed across the shale and packed into the folds of his collar. Somewhere downslope, a heavy machine gun kept chopping in measured bursts, the sound flat and ugly in the storm. Each string, followed by the crack and whip of rounds ripping through pine bark. Resin sprayed into the air. Splinters hissed past. Adrenaline left a dry, metallic taste at the back of his tongue. His squad had gone still around him in the shallow rock shelf they were using for cover. Men knew what a black signal meant. They also knew HQ would turn it into a timetable before the dead had cooled. The radio in his gloved hand spat static, then a voice clean with distance and heat from some shelter miles away. He kept breathing through his teeth. Short in. Longer out? The way you did when anger wanted to get louder than judgment, Thorne. Move now. Triage 4 has been wiped out. HQ did not shout often. It didn't need to. Flat voices from warm rooms carried their own kind of violence. Pressing the earpiece harder against his head, he looked toward the ravine they were being told to use. On the map, it was the fastest withdrawal route. On the ground, it was a throat of open snow between black rock faces. No deadfall, no ruined vehicle, no fold deep enough to hide a kneeling man. Too clean. That bothered him before the binoculars even came up. Frost had skinned the metal barrels white. He wiped the lenses with the back of his glove and set the eye cups into his face. The world snapped, narrow and close. Snow streamed sideways. Muzzle flashes blinked low and disciplined from a cut in the opposite ridge. Not random suppression. Interlocking lanes. He tracked a burst the way you tracked a surgeon's hand, by what it took apart. The first rounds chewed a pine trunk chest high. The second string walked lower. Shaved bark. Shattered stone. Then stitched the center of the ravine where a file of men would bottleneck and lose spacing. The beaten zone overlapped itself like someone had taken a ruler to it. Enter there, and bodies would stack before the rear element, understood the front had already been opened up. Glasses lowered for half a second, and every sound came back harder. Wind. Static. Men breathing through balaclavas. Somebody muttering a range number. He brought the optics up again and forced himself to watch one more burst. The heavy rounds did not just hit. They carried on. Through brush, through sapling trunks, through the kind of hope headquarters liked to label concealment. One of his corporals edged closer on a knee, waiting for the move order that should have come already. Thorne didn't give it. A legal charge for disobeying in contact was still better than zipping his own people into bags because somebody with a blue screen trusted contour lines more than trajectories. He thumbed the radio. Breath hissed through his teeth before the words, "Hold up." "Something's wrong," HQ answered at once. All procedure and no pulse. Demanding movement. Demanding compliance. Demanding the sort of faith that always cost the man on the ground more than the one giving it. Thorne ignored the rest and kept studying the kill lane until he could feel the timing of the gunner. 4-count pause. Barrel correction. Burst. Shift. Burst. A machine crew covering exactly where they'd been told to run. Not bad luck. A burial plan. Dropping behind the rock lip, he made the call with his hand first, 2 fingers chopping low to keep the squad pinned in place. Nobody argued. They could hear the HMG doing the math for them. Snow-crust ground under knees and elbows as they tightened in. Thorne keyed the radio again, but didn't answer HQ this time. Not yet. He wanted another 10 seconds. 10 could be the whole damn war when you were waiting for something impossible to prove you weren't crazy. The KIA square still blinked on his wrist, cold and black as a shut eye, and he found himself staring at it longer than he liked. Mercer was supposed to be dead under that mountain of broken concrete. Fine. Dead people did not care what orders came next. Dead people also didn't usually vanish without leaving a mess behind. A concussion rolled somewhere beneath the ridge, subtle enough that only the men touching the ground felt it. Then the enemy made their own clock. Grenades came out of the storm in dark little arcs and hit the slope below with hollow pops. 1, 2, 3. Smoke spread fast, thick and greasy, climbing the shelf in rolling grey walls, meant to blind, split, and cover an uphill sweep. Thorne watched it boil toward them, jaw locked, and kept his men frozen where they were as the ravine disappeared and the assault began to build behind that smoke. Boots on packed snow sounded different through a vent pipe than they did in open air. Sharper, closer to bone. Sloane Mercer pressed one cheek to the freezing floor and listened while chalk dust drifted down from the half-cut ceiling and settled on her lips. One set moved heavy and fast. Another checked pace to match. Friendly. Infantry trying not to die. Above them the storm dragged smoke across the ridge in dirty waves, and under that wind she could still pick out the HMG working its lane in patient bursts. Same rhythm. Same beaten zone. Somebody up there was still feeding men toward a kill box, unless Thorne had found a reason not to. Her nicotine gum had gone flat and bitter, but she kept chewing anyway. The Marine with the clamped groin wound was still alive behind her, breathing shallow through dust. The backup monitor on the wall blinked 12% in weak green pulses, then dimmed, then came back like it regretted the effort. Mercer tracked sound the way other people tracked maps. Boots above the vent. HMG to the east. Smoke grenades spreading. Her people were seconds from stepping into math they could not see. The severed communications cable near the overturned bed spat another tiny red spark. Copper. Residual current. Possibility. Dragging the defibrillator across broken tile by the handle. She fought it past debris and a dead IV stand before getting it beside the hanging cable. The machine felt absurdly heavy for something built to bully a failing heart. Her thumb hit the power switch. The screen woke in a weak green wash, battery bars already starving. Enough for one clean insult. Maybe. Up went the charge selector until the number hit 360. A rising electronic whine filled the dark. Ozone bit the back of her nose before the paddles were even ready. Blue indicator light washed over her hands. over dried blood on her sleeves, over the scarred stub of her left index finger, where grip always became geometry instead of instinct. She braced the torn cable with that damaged hand, feeling insulation grit bite into old scar tissue. One paddle went to exposed copper. The other she jammed against the steel bed frame to force a crude path. Overhead, a heel scraped, paused, shifted. Friendly movement under pressure. Her jaw worked once, then again. The charged tone climbed. Static snapped somewhere in the wire bundle. The room smelled like hot pennies and lightning. One breath. Hold. Then she dumped 360 joules straight into the torn copper core. Marcus Thorne heard the burst of interference as a hard tick-tick-tick in his headset, sharp enough to cut through wind, smoke, and the HMG gnawing trees below. He froze for less than a heartbeat. Not voice traffic. Pattern. The radio chattered again, clipped and unnatural, and his brain did the translation before doubt could get organized. Hatch B. Clear. Mercer. Below. Blue lights stuttered through the buried aid station, while the cable spat like a live snake, and the defibrillator kicked in Mercer's hands, hard enough to jar her wrists. Burnt insulation filled the room. Above. Thorne ripped the microphone close and barked, "Cancel HQ order. Entire element. Shift axis. We push for hatch B. Move." He did not wait for permission. Men pivoted at once, boots tearing through crusted snow, bodies angling away from the ravine. The HMG had been zeroing like a burial trench. Somebody echoed the order down the line. Somebody else threw smoke deeper into the old lane to keep the gunner occupied. Mercer glanced at the defibrillator screen and watched 12% collapse to 7, then 4, then a weak flicker that nearly vanished. The monitor on the wall blinked in sympathy. Green. Black. Green. The room around her got thinner, meaner, less powered. The machine gave one soft, wounded chirp and died under her palm. The answer came through the ceiling. The magnetic drill above her punched through the last sheet of steel with a shriek that made her teeth hurt. A bright metal bit dropped into the room, trailing sparks. Then the cut panel around it sagged all at once. Mercer lunged for the Marine's litter and dragged with both arms, boots skidding in dust and blood, because 6 inches mattered when ceilings chose targets blind. She got maybe 4. Then the section let go. Steel struts snapped. Brick and plaster came down in a white wall. Something hit her shoulder and drove her sideways. Grit packed her nose. Her gum cracked between her molars. The backup screen guttered to a pinprick, then flared weakly again as the last reserve power bled out. Over the collapse came a new sound, louder now that the hole was open. Boots on torn metal. More than one set. Men stacking over the breach. Dust boiled through the room so thick it turned the remaining green light into swamp fog. Mercer shoved herself up on one elbow, coughing chalk, and looked at the ragged opening just as the first shadow blocked it out. The first breacher dropped through the hole feet first, then twisted in the air and landed hard enough to shake broken tile under Mercer's palms. 3 more followed right behind him. Big men in armor and helmets, thermal rigs already glowing dull red through the dust. They moved with the ugly confidence of people entering a room they believed had already been killed for them. One tossed a gas canister left. Another sent one right. Both hit the floor with hollow clinks and started puking out a harsh cloud that clawed at the eyes and throat even before it spread. Mercer was already moving, low and blind, one hand on the wall because the backup power had sagged to a sick green smear and the whole station had become a map made of memory and pain. Her gum worked once, wet, loud inside her own skull. No rifle, No light worth trusting. Just the marine half buried behind her, the bent isolation antechamber ahead, and 4 silhouettes cutting the room apart by heat. A suppressed pistol coughed once into the rubble where she had been. Thermal lenses swept after the shot in tight mechanical arcs. Smart men. Efficient men. Fine. Efficient men could still be lied to. Heat could be lied to. Air could be weaponized. The 2 oxygen cylinders beside the isolation door were still upright, green paint scarred, gauges showing 3000 psi. Slipping into the antechamber, she yanked the warp door most of the way in, not sealed, just narrowed enough to shape the space. Her hand slipped on blood, so she put her shoulder into the first valve wheel. Resistance. Then release. Compressed oxygen came out with a scream, not a hiss. A tearing, high metallic shriek that filled the chamber and seemed to peel the last quiet out of the room. Frost flashed around the regulator. The second cylinder fought harder. Her left hand, short on leverage because of the missing finger joints, skated over chipped paint before she caught the wheel with palm and thumb and forced it open. Another blast. Another violent white rush of pressure. Oxygen poured into the small chamber, then spilled back out through the gap and into the treatment room in invisible hard sheets. The gas canisters kept burning their chemical fog into it. Mercer flattened herself against the steel frame and listened under the shriek. Boots adjusting position. Fabric rubbing ceramic plate. A glove tapping a shoulder to signal stack order. Then the little plastic click of a radio being thumbed. Her jaw slowed. Her breathing did not. This was the whole trick now. No fire being set by her hand. Just a room built so one careless spark would turn breath itself traitor. The lead breacher moved through the haze first. Pistol up, thermal visor angling toward the hotter place she had just left. Another man stacked tight on him, mask tilted, ready to flood the door. The front man hit his push to talk. That was it. Somewhere inside the switch, a tiny static jump snapped across cheap contact metal. In ordinary air it would have been nothing. Here it turned the world blue. The flash fire came silent in the wrong way. Not a bomb, not a roar. More like the room inhaled all at once and forgot to give the air back. Blue light sheeted through the chamber so bright Mercer saw every scratch in the doorframe and every crack spidering across the lead visor in one frozen blink. Then the pressure drop punched her ears inward. The flame front stripped oxygen out of the space and out of the men at the front with it. Both breaches folded almost immediately. One hit the isolation door shoulder first and bent the lower hinge with a steel scream. The other collapsed flat, pistol bouncing once across tile before his hand spasmed open. The smell arrived a beat later. Scorched fabric, cooked meat, melted plastic from the radio housing. Mercer turned her face into her elbow and kept low while blue afterimages pulsed across her vision. Behind the bodies, the last 2 men recoiled on reflex. One tore his thermal rig off so hard it snapped against his chest plate. The other stumbled backward, half-crouched, trying not to touch what he didn't understand. Tarn did not waste even that much motion. He stopped just outside the chamber, took in his dead, the bent hinge, the hiss of the cylinders, and changed tactics in a single cold beat. Mercer saw the size of him first, then the stillness. Level 4 plates under dust. Pistol low with a suppressor. Blade already in his other hand because he had understood the lesson faster than the rest. One sharp hand signal. Immediate obedience. One surviving breacher tore off his radio and dropped it. The other killed his thermal unit and let it fall beside the bodies. No more electronics. No more sparks. The hunt had gone quiet. Oxygen still rushed from both cylinders, softer now but steady enough to cover smaller sounds. One of the dead men twitched once and was done. Mercer reached by feel, found the cold grip of the dropped pistol and took it. Her gum made one small, ugly smack in the dark. Across the blue-stained haze, Tarn raised the knife just a little, not theatrical, just ready, and stepped toward her without a word. The first man to touch Hatch B got answered by gunfire. Marcus Thorne saw the impact line before he heard the full burst, snow kicking up in a diagonal across the steel lid and the shale around it as the enemy found the new axis and corrected hard. His squad had come in low through the storm, bent under packs and weapons, trusting a dead station and a ghost message from under the mountain. Now the mountain was trying to charge interest. The hatch sat in a shallow cut between two black rock shoulders, half buried in rime and drift, steel plate rimmed with ice, hinge housings iced over. A perfect choke point. Of course it was. One engineer dropped to the lid with a pry bar. Another covered him before a round, chewed bark off the pine above his head and showered them both with splinters. Somewhere off left, an HMG laid down another tearing burst that cut through saplings like wet dowels. Cold metal, sap, cordite, and the iron taste of adrenaline filled the air. Hitting the ground behind a slab of rock, Thorne glassed the hatch and saw the problem immediately. The steel lid was not merely locked. It had warped. The blast from below had kicked the frame crooked. The hinge line sat proud on one side and jammed on the other. He waved the engineers in anyway, because there was no better option left alive. Pry bars went under the lip. Shoulders leaned in. Nothing. Just a low groan from stressed steel. Another man came off the line to help. 3 bodies now. Boots slipping in packed snow. Gloved hands straining, backs bowed, while enemy fire stitched the rocks around them. A young rifleman on the near side shifted to cover their right flank and caught a round through the calf before he finished planting his knee. The hit spun him sideways and dumped him into the snow. One high, shocked scream, then both hands clamped around the ruined leg. Blood spread black-red through white crust in a widening fan. Thorne moved before the second shot came. Sliding in, he grabbed webbing and hauled the kid behind a rock spur with one hand while firing blind suppression with the other. The rifle bucked hot against his shoulder. Burned oil rose off the bolt between breaths. The engineer team kept straining at the hatch because stopping would make the whole detour meaningless. Thorne shoved the young soldier into cover, slapped a pressure bandage into his hands and growled, "Bite down on it! Hold the perimeter! She's right below us!" Whether the kid understood the words, or only the tone, didn't matter. He bit down on the dressing wrapper and nodded through tears and snowmelt. Then the enemy tightened the noose. Fire came in from the left cut and the high ridge together, crossing low over the hatch site so tight the snow itself seemed to flinch. Thorne rose into it because somebody had to own the centre long enough for the engineers to keep working. Braced behind a stunted pine, he shot controlled pairs at muzzle flashes, half hidden by storm haze. One shape dropped. Another shifted. A heartbeat later, something hit his shoulder like a sledge wrapped in fire. Not a clean bullet strike through meat. Fragment, or glancing round. It smashed through cloth and into the top of his shoulder blade, spun him sideways and left his right arm numb for one ugly second before pain came flooding in hot and bright. Warm blood ran under his field jacket at once, slicking his ribs, soaking fabric that the -18 air tried to freeze around the edges. He sucked iron off his tongue and kept shooting. Around him the perimeter formed the way bad things always did in war, not elegant, not planned, just men dropping into whatever cover existed and deciding they were not dead yet. One grenadier fired smoke downslope to thicken the screen. Another started feeding ammo by hand along the line. At the hatch, a pry bar finally bit deeper under the warped steel, and the lid answered with a sharper shriek. Thorne dropped to one knee behind the pine, only because his legs made the choice for him. He pressed his rifle stock into the pocket below the wounded shoulder and worked around the pain like it was weather. The engineers were cursing now because the hatch had lifted maybe half an inch and stuck again. The frame below had bellied upward from the blast. Bent metal, swollen pressure, frozen grit, every bad variable in one place. A rifle cracked close and stone chips slapped his cheek. He fired back at the flash and watched snow jump where his round struck. The wounded young soldier was still in the fight, pale as chalk, dragging himself into position where he could cover the approach with his rifle laid over a rock and his ruined leg leaving a red trail behind him. Good enough. More than enough. Thorne's blood kept running warm down his side. each pulse a reminder that this whole ring of bodies and muzzle flashes existed because he had disobeyed. Fine. Orders were cheap. Ground truth was expensive. Then he heard it. Faint under gunfire and wind, a hard metallic banging from below the warped steel lid, followed by one muffled shot from deep in the mountain. Teeth bared against the pain, he raised his voice over the storm and kept the perimeter alive while the hatch shuddered under the engineer's tools. Tarn moved through the dark like a machine built for one hallway and one purpose. Watching him through a slit beside an overturned cabinet, Sloane Mercer kept still while cold IV bags slid under her collar and down her spine. One sat at the base of her skull, one across the left shoulder, one under the back of her blouse where the plastic pressed against skin like a slab of river ice. The shock of it kept stealing her breath. Good, that was the point. His men had killed their thermals, but Tarn still hunted like a man who trusted heat ghosts, air movement, recent contact, all the small betrayals a body made when it was still warm and trying to stay alive. Mercer needed her surface temperature wrecked badly enough to smear that picture. The price came right away. Her jaw started knocking on its own. Little involuntary spasms jumped through her shoulders. Muscle along her spine drew tight until it felt braided. Gums snapped wetly between her teeth and lost whatever flavor had been left in it. The hallway stank of chemical cleanser, cooked fabric, old oxygen burn, and fresh blood. One dead breacher lay half across the tile behind Tarn. Another had made it 2 crawling feet and stopped. Somewhere behind her, the last oxygen leaked out with a thin, exhausted hiss. Tarn passed her blind angle by inches, suppressor low, knife loose in his other hand. Too early, and she died for nothing. Coming out of cover felt ugly from the first inch. A palm sliding on slime. One knee skidding. The pistol lifting through a tremor she could not stop. Her teeth were chattering so hard, the sound inside her skull nearly drowned out the shot. The plan had been simple. 2 rounds into the seam below his arm where the plate ended. Clean. Anatomical. Fast. Then the cold wrecked the timing at the last possible second. Her hands spasmed as she pressed the trigger. The first round hit low, punching into his pelvic girdle with a sound like a hammer driving into green wood. The second went lower still, tearing through the other side. Tarn made one short, brutal noise. Not pain exactly, more outrage from a giant body whose structure had just been taken apart. His right leg collapsed first. The left tried to save him and failed. He dropped crooked, one knee smashing tile, pistol hand jerking up too late. Mercer tried to move, and her own footing went out from under her on blood and disinfectant. The suppressor coughed past her hip. Something hot grazed her ribs. Then he was on her. Not graceful, not tactical, just huge. Half falling, half driving through momentum, enough weight to turn the air itself into pressure. His fist crossed her mouth and split her lip against her teeth. Salt and iron flooded her tongue. The pistol flew away into the dark. After that, the fight stopped being choreography and turned into physics. Tarn weighed too much. The floor had too little friction. Cleanser, blood, plaster grit, leaked IV fluid, all of it mixed under them into a thin, treacherous film that made every effort slide wide. Mercer felt him more than saw him. Chest weight, armor edges, breath through clenched teeth. Hot and furious on her face. The pelvic hits had broken the standing frame but not the upper body, and the upper body was enough. Her shoulder slammed into the wall. The back of her head glanced off tile. He kept coming, all pressure and grab and brutal unfinished motions. She jammed an elbow into the wound line near his groin and got half a breath for it. The knife hand rose. Both her hands caught his wrist and barely kept the blade off her throat, while cold spasms kept running through her arms, breaking strength into stutters. There was no clean counter here, no clever reversal, just failing muscle, failing oxygen, and the certainty that he could still crush her if chemistry did not get there first. So she quit trying to win by force. Her left hand tore free, fumbled at the med pouch clipped behind her hip, missed once because the cold had turned her fingers stupid, then found the fentanyl auto-injector by shape alone. Plastic cylinder, safety cap. She ripped it loose with her teeth, drove it hard into the groove beside his carotid, and felt the thunk as it fired. Still no miracle. Of course not. Drugs had vessels to cross and signals to interrupt. Mercer went flat under him, while Tarn's hand locked onto her throat, fingers closing hard enough to crush speech before it formed. Black sparks crowded the edges of her sight. 1 second. Air turned to a hot thread. 2. Her boots scraped uselessly on the slick tile. 3. His grip was still there, still murderous, but the sequence had started to break. Not weakness. Lag. Orders arriving late in damaged wet meat. 4. The thumb slipped first, then the ring finger. Then the whole hand sagged as the fentanyl hit the big muscles, and they forgot how to obey. Tarn dropped on top of her like cut cable. Rolling half free, Mercer sucked in air that felt like broken glass. He hit the floor on his side, heavy as stone, eyes open, not dead, not close enough to trust, but out of the fight. She lay there another second, coughing red into cleanser and blood, throat on fire, every muscle still shivering under the cold bags taped to her skin. Then came the spit of a clot onto tile. One look at the giant beside her. Still down. Good. For now. The thermal lance began with a spit of white sparks under the titanium door and then settled into a steady, vicious hiss, like somebody had trapped a cutting torch inside the wall and let it feed. Sloane Mercer heard the pitch change and looked at the seam glowing dull red along the bottom edge. 4 minutes if the feed stayed stable. Maybe less if the operator outside knew what he was doing. Heat pushed into the room in slow, ugly breaths, warming one side of her face while the rest of her stayed cold from the IV bag still taped under her collar and across her back. The contrast made her shiver again. Tarn lay where he had fallen, huge body twisted on dirty tile, eyes half open, throat working around breath he could not fully command yet. Fentanyl had left him breathing, not moving. Good enough. She tried once to hook both hands under his harness and drag him up onto the surgical table. He moved 6 inches and stopped. Too much mass. Too little leverage with her mauled left hand and the room already bleeding time. Fine. Floor surgery it was. Wiping her lip with the back of her wrist, she dropped to one knee in the slurry of cleanser and dragged the instrument roll closer. The hemostat from the first Marine was still in her pocket, cold as a coin. Out it came, thumb checking the ratchet teeth by feel, then down beside Tarn's neck while the lance kept chewing at the door. The floor made a filthy operating field, but physics had never cared about dignity. Rolling Tarn flat with one boot against his shoulder and one hand under his jaw, Mercer felt his pulse beating against her fingers, faster now. 50 had been his machine speed. The drugs were thinning. The pelvic hit had added shock to the equation. His body was relearning panic. She stripped open the collar, found the groove she wanted, and painted the skin with iodine from a cracked prep stick that bled brown across sweat and grime. No proper surgical lamp came on. Reserve power was too far gone for that kind of luxury. All she had was the weak green monitor glow, the red seam of the titanium door, and the white flare of sparks blowing under the threshold in angry little stars. The heart monitor on the wall was still alive enough to give her rhythm. Beep, pause, beep, scalpel, forceps, gauze. Suction dead, so forget it. Then the security camera angled down with the toe of her boot until the cracked lens took in exactly what she needed it to see. Outside, the thermal lance bit deeper. Heat shimmered through the room. Tarn's eyelids fluttered. Mercer made the first cut anyway. Skin. Fat. Then the careful spread through tissue planes until darker flow welled, and the artery announced itself with a thick, stubborn pulse under the wound. Working with the kind of economy people mislabeled inhuman when they had never been forced to choose speed over grace, Mercer packed gauze, spread tissue with 2 fingers, and set the clamp ready. Tarn's neck was warm under her gloves, pulse climbing harder now that chemistry was surrendering ground. A tremor from the cold packs ran up her forearm and made her nick a hair too deep. No lecture, no panic, just correction. The next pass found the vessel clean. The artery jumped against the forceps tip, alive and mean. In went the hemostat. 1 click, 2. The surge stopped and settled into a dark, trembling line around the steel jaws. There, a life valve. Outside, the thermal lance screamed hotter. White sparks blasted under the titanium door and skipped across the tile around her knees. The lower hinge changed colour in stages, blue to straw to angry orange. Mercer reached up and thumbed the security console with a blood-slick knuckle. The hallway feed jumped onto the monitor outside the room. Tarn's exposed throat, her hands working, the hemostat sitting there like a hooked beak at the centre of everything. She angled the lens tighter so no one outside could mistake what they were seeing. Let them look straight at how alive he still was, and how little separated that from dead. The hiss outside changed, not stopped, hesitated. Tarn came back a piece at a time, eyes focusing instead of floating, jaw tightening, a dry swallow that failed under clamp pressure. Mercer kept one hand on the hemostat and watched the monitor crawl while the heat from the door pulled sweat out of her hairline. He looked at the steel on his artery, then at her face, then at the screen showing his opened throat to the men outside, smart enough to understand all of it. When he finally spoke, the voice was torn thin through strain and pain. "You're bound by the convention. You can't kill me." Mercer did not answer. No point. Outside, the thermal lance still hissed on the far side of the titanium, but slower now, less committed. The operator forced to think about what happened. If he finished the cut, and his commander bled out on camera the second the door opened. Tighter around the cold steel, her grip held the hemostat steady while Tarn lay awake under her hand, and the glowing red line in the titanium kept crawling. Tarn's whisper about the convention lasted less than a second before the monitor took the room back. Beep. Pause. Beep. Sloane Mercer kept chewing, slow and wet, tasting nicotine, iron, and the dry metallic heat coming off the titanium door. Outside, the cutting hiss had not fully stopped, but it had lost confidence. Good. Hesitation was its own kind of anesthesia. She looked down at the hemostat biting Tarn's artery and set her thumb on the ratchet. Steel stayed cold even in the heat. 1 millimeter was nothing in most worlds. In a neck wound, with a heart still trying to save a dying body, it was a vote. She eased the clamp open that tiny measured distance. Not enough to blow the vessel free. Just enough. The pressure shifted immediately, a steady warning sign that turned into a hot runnel down his skin. Tarn felt it before he understood it. Eyes widening, then narrowing, he tried to reassert control over a body already selling him out. Mercer glanced at the monitor. Pressure falling, heart rate climbing. A little tacky pop came off the gum in her cheek. Not looking at him when she spoke, she looked at the numbers and read them the way somebody else might read weather. Systolic's 80. Compensatory heart rate's 140. Core temp is 95. Starting to feel cold in your fingertips? The tone stayed flat enough to pass for machine output. No sermon, no triumph, just observation. Tarn tried to answer with contempt and managed only a swallow that pushed his pulse faster around the clamp. Sweat stood out along his forehead, even as the cold started pulling circulation inward from his hands. His fingers twitched against the tile near his chest, then curled as if he could close them around sensation before it left. Mercer watched the pulse trace jitter thinner and faster. Outside, the thermal lance coughed and resumed for 3 angry seconds, then paused again when the hallway feed showed his rapid decline. Good. The men outside were still doing the only humane thing they had left, which was selfish hesitation. Tarn's breathing changed next. Not faster, shallower. More effort for less result. Vision would be narrowing now. Peripheral dark first. Then center grey, if she kept the clamp where it was. She turned the hemostat another hair, almost absent-mindedly, and listened to the monitor strain. His body entered the ugly part fast. The warrior disappeared by degrees, piece by piece, as circulation quit honoring the story his mind preferred. Color drained from his mouth. His hands went waxy. Once, he tried to push himself up on an elbow and could not coordinate the effort because the signal path between will and muscle was running on less fuel than before. Mercer saw one pupil widen a shade faster than the other. One more beep stretched too long, then another. Tarn stopped looking at her and started looking through the room, trying to assemble it from shrinking fragments. His lips moved. Not words yet. Air. The cold had gone internal now. Not mountain cold, but circulatory cold. The kind that spread from the center outward and made men stare at their own fingers as if they belonged to somebody else. A tremor ran through his jaw. Mercer kept chewing, kept watching the numbers, kept one hand on the hemostat and the other near the monitor cable in case the room died on her. Outside, something slapped the titanium door. Signal, panic, frustration. Didn't matter. The lance would not commit. Tarn heard none of it correctly anymore. His focus lurched back to her face and failed to hold. The physiological reality was taking him where argument never could, grinding conviction down to tissue response and chemistry. The radio near his shoulder had been dropped there earlier, stripped of dignity but not usefulness. Tarn found it in 2 tries. The first miss was wide and clumsy. The second closed around plastic, with all the delicacy of a man reaching through deep water. Mercer did not help him. She did not hurry him either. The monitor gave another stretched beep. Her gum snapped once, sharp and ugly in the heat. Tarn dragged the radio to his mouth, breath hitching, fingertips shaking so badly the push-to-talk button clicked twice before he held it down. When he spoke, the command had no grandeur left in it, just a man freezing from the inside, while his own body deserted him. Fall back. Cancel the sweep. Pull out now. Silence followed except for the monitor, the strain of a faltering heart, and the diminished hiss of the thermal lance outside going dead for real. Mercer counted 3 beats and eased the hemostat closed again by that same careful millimeter. The pressure stabilized. Tarn sagged flat. Not unconscious, just emptied of the last illusion that will could beat physiology. Above them, somewhere through rock and steel, Marcus Thorne's hill was being handed back to him one frightened order at a time. The gunfire on the ridge did not taper off so much as vanish all at once, and that was worse. Marcus Thorne had lived long enough inside firefights to know noise could lie, but silence usually meant somebody had decided something final. He stood over Hatch B, with blood dried stiff down one sleeve, and fresher blood still leaking warm under the field dressing packed into his shoulder. The engineers had finally bullied the warped steel lid high enough to get fingers and pry bars under it. Every inch had cost skin, leverage, and 2 men nearly getting cut apart in the open. Now the hatch gave with a long, rusty shriek that echoed down into black air and stale heat. No return fire came up from below. No shouted challenge. Just a draft that smelled wrong for a mountain bunker. Burnt meat, antiseptic, hot metal gone cold again. Thorne took the ladder first because rank did not mean much if you made somebody younger step into whatever waited under there. Boots rang on steel rungs slick with condensation and grime. Red emergency lights below pulsed weakly, turning the shaft walls into the inside of a wounded organ. One of his sergeants came after him, rifle up. Another followed slower, dragging a leg. Nobody talked. Their breathing sounded too loud in the ladder well. Muzzle low, eyes high. Thorne felt the silence press in tighter the farther down he climbed. At the bottom, the underground station looked less like a medical site than the inside of a machine forced to eat men. The treatment room had been crushed, burned, and chemically stripped all at once. 2 breacher bodies lay near an isolation door, blackened in patches where the oxygen fire had kissed them and moved on. Their gear had melted in glossy streaks. One thermal visor had fused half into a cheekbone. Another corpse, farther back, still held one arm out, as if reaching for balance on the way down. Red fluorescence blinked overhead with the faint insect hum cheap emergency systems made when they were close to dying. Each flash changed the room. Blood black, then red, then black again. Dust hanging in the air with the sweet, sour smell of cooked tissue and iodine. Thorne's men saw it too. He heard the small, involuntary sounds they made when the optic hit before the brain could dress it up in professional language. But the center of the room was not the dead. It was the live one. Sloane Mercer sat on one knee in a pool of diluted prep solution, and Grime, face swollen on one side, lower lip split, uniform torn open at the shoulder where the cold packs had once been taped down. In front of her lay Tarn, huge, even unconscious, throat opened and then partly closed again by her hand. Mercer held a skin stapler over the wound with the same calm somebody else might use fixing a torn map. The stapler made a dry metallic clack each time she pressed it. Clack, pause, clack, little silver teeth biting skin together over the swollen line in Tarn's neck, while the hemostat still sat ready near the dressing like the memory of a threat. Mercer did not look up when Thorne entered. One staple finished, thumb checking the edge, another placed. That composure got him more than the bodies did. Not indifference, not frenzy. Just a woman working through a task list at the far end of what most people would call human enough. Thorne stepped over a burned arm, lowered his rifle an inch, and took in the whole equation. Dead breachers. Live commander. Mercer on the floor instead of at a table because the giant bastard had been too heavy to move. Security camera still angled toward the hall, no wasted motion anywhere. One of Thorne's men swore softly behind him. Mercer finally glanced up, eyes bloodshot but steady. He followed her line down to the clamp, to the neck, to the blunt, ugly fact of what she had done to hold this room together long enough for the ridge to quiet. The only question that mattered came out flat from exhaustion and blood loss. Can he walk? Mercer peeled off one glove with her teeth, then the other, and tossed both aside into a puddle gone pink around the edges. No. Brain went too long without oxygen. She said it the way somebody might report battery levels. Thorne looked at Tarn another second. The chest still moved. Barely. Eyes rolled under the lids but did not wake. Whatever had survived inside that skull was no longer a field commander, just meat with rank sewn into it. He had seen enough ruined men to know the difference. Lowering his rifle the rest of the way, he felt his soldiers around him staring at Mercer and then away from her, as if the room had shown them something useful they were not sure they wanted to keep. Fine. They could sort that out later, or never. The ridge was theirs again. That was the part command would understand. Everything else would get turned into paperwork. Thorne wiped a sleeve across his mouth, tasted old blood and cordite, and made the call without ceremony. Leave him. Then he turned before anyone could treat the order like drama. Boots scraped tile behind him as the men started backing toward the ladder. Mercer did not ask for thanks. Thorne did not offer it. Red light blinked over Tarn's half-closed throat, over the burned dead, over the ruined room where medicine and combat had shared the same floor for one long, ugly hour. Then Thorne climbed back toward the hatch and left the giant where he lay, alive enough to breathe, useless enough to disappear into the dark. 3 weeks later the room was so quiet it made the ridge feel merciful by comparison, though Sloane Mercer did not think about the ridge once while she sat there. The hearing chamber had been built inside the military medical center, like an afterthought for clean punishments. Soundproof walls, white fluorescent panels so bright they flattened depth out of everything and made skin look prepped for dissection. Stainless steel table bolted to the floor. 2 chairs. No window. No clock. The air smelled of filter systems, printer heat, and whatever industrial cleaner they used to erase the last human trace from rooms like this. Mercer sat straight-backed in a fresh uniform that fit correctly and felt fraudulent. Her face had healed into yellow and brown beneath the kind of corrective makeup nobody bothered to call makeup. The missing joints of her left index finger still interrupted the line of one hand resting on the table. That, at least, the room had not managed to iron out. Across from her sat a medical flag officer, with a legal aid's voice and a clinician's eyes, the sort of man who looked at catastrophe and first calculated whether it could be standardized. A red file folder lay between them on the table. thick, crisp-edged. Already decided. He opened it without preamble and began reading charges in a tone so dry it seemed, designed to keep moral language from contaminating the mechanism of what came next. He did not accuse her of evil. That would have implied a soul somewhere in the process. He recited conduct, improvisational use of a detainee's survivability as leverage, tactical manipulation of a captive through controlled vascular threat, unauthorized medical intervention outside, accepted detainee handling protocol. Phrase after phrase came dry and bureaucratic, and Mercer listened the way she had listened to failing monitors in the bunker. For variance, for what the numbers underneath the words were doing. There was no outrage in him, no disgust. That was the first useful thing. The second was what he skipped. No mention of the Marines who lived because she rerouted Thorn. No mention of the enemy withdrawal. No mention of the fact that the system now possessed hard proof that she could make a battlefield obey anatomy under pressure. He was not there to shame her. He was there to inventory value and decide how to hide it. When he finished one page, he set it aside with almost surgical neatness and studied her for a beat too long. Mercer gave him nothing back. No apology, no defense. Her jaw moved once on an empty reflex where the gum usually sat, then went still. The silence in the room swallowed even that. By the time he read the next page, the hearing had stopped pretending to be about law and become what it had been from the start, a procurement meeting wearing a tribunal's face. The red folder slid across the stainless steel with a soft scrape and stopped under her hand. On top sat her public credential packet. Medical licensing data, civilian transfer clearances, identity traces that would have let her exist in daylight after the war ended, if anyone in that room had believed daylight was the right place for her. Deliberately, the officer placed a brass stamp beside the folder. Heavy thing, old, maintained. The kind of tool institutions loved because it let force masquerade as procedure. Then came the truth in its neatest form. Too operationally useful for prison, too contaminating for open practice, too politically radioactive for exoneration. So the system had chosen efficiency. Civilian authority revoked, public file terminated, operational status reclassified into compartments where deniability would matter more than doctrine. He did not say Black Ops right away. Men like him preferred euphemism until the very last instant. Mercer looked at the stamp, then the black ink pad, then the exact place on the folder where the blow would land. That told her more than his voice had. Whatever she had been before Triage 4 had already died under the mortar. This was just paperwork, catching up. He inked the brass, lifted it, and said, with chilling professional softness, "We are discontinuing your public designation and reallocating your capabilities to a restricted mission set." Then the stamp came down hard. The sound cracked through the soundproof room like a rifle shot trapped in a jar. When he lifted it, the mark sat across her record in blunt black letters. KIA. Transferred to Covert Ops. There it was. A death certificate and a job assignment, sharing the same line because the machine saw no contradiction. Mercer read it once and did not blink. The officer closed the folder, turned it 90 degrees, and that was the end of whatever public self had once attached to her license number. No handshake followed. No patriotic nonsense about sacrifice. No softening remark. He had extracted the useful conclusion, and the room had no further need for theatre. Mercer reached into the breast pocket of her clean uniform, pulled out a nicotine gum blister, and peeled back the foil with the careful economy of somebody dressing a wound. The tiny crinkle of wrapper sounded loud in the padded room. She put the piece in her mouth and started chewing before anyone dismissed her. Bitter mint hit first. Then, the chemical burn she had always trusted more than comfort. Her jaw worked. Once. Twice. On the third chew, the gums snapped sharp between her teeth, a small, hard report that echoed farther in that sealed white room than it had any right to. Then the fluorescent light held steady, the soundproof walls swallowed everything else, and the ghost the radios had spoken of went to work.